Welcome back to our Agent Ready series, where we're talking with different founders and engineering leaders around how to turn your applications and make them agent ready, and what does that mean in different contexts. I'm Reed, co-founder and CEO here at Stitch, and I'm joined today by Alex Rattray, who is the founder and CEO at Stainless. Now, could you tell us a little bit about what Stainless does before we dive in, and just maybe a brief intro?
Sure. So I started Stainless after working on the API platform team at Stripe, where I did API docs and also SDKs. Stainless is best known for the SDKs that we generate for companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Cloudflare. And we generate MCP servers as well.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited about today's topic. Gets a little bit meta around everything where, because, I think Stainless's role in the ecosystem as being someone that helps companies maintain, build net new APIs, obviously dovetails really nicely into this moment that we're having around MCP servers, which is the question that a lot of applications are having that we talk to when they ask, how do we become agent ready, is how should I think about what is the interface for those agents to take actions within my application? What should those APIs look like? How should I support them? And so super excited to dive into that. Maybe before we get into kind of the nitty gritty of, MCP, I'd love to hear just a little bit more about like how you think about the opportunity in front of us from like a user experience, if we can drive this type of, different experience.
Yeah. I think it's such a fascinating time. And, I've been an API person for a while now. And if you rewind, I think 15 years ago, and you look around the world of technology, you would see most companies building, user interfaces, most SaaS companies. And most companies, there weren't a lot of real API companies, most companies didn't have an API. Now most companies have an API. If you're doing sort of any kind of business to business, SaaS sort of work, but everyone's still logging into a user interface, right? So, if I'm a user of Stitch, I'm going to log in to manage my projects and so on. If I'm a user of Stripe, I'm going to be spending a lot of time in the dashboard, maybe offering refunds to customers or seeing how our revenue did last month or something like that, configuring, etc. And if you look at the day-to-day life of a lot of people working in software, really any industry, if you tend to spend a lot of time logging into a bunch of different apps, admins, dashboards, and clicking around a lot, opening up modals and filling out forms, browsing through lists of rows of information, and you got your list views and your detail views, and anyone doing full stack application work knows all about this stuff. And we're getting to a point where I think a lot of people would rather just be talking to ChatGPT or Claude or Cursor or what have you. And rather than saying, okay, I need to go refund somebody's order for these socks, let me go click around the Stripe dashboard and find the right person and figure out how to do the refund and then figure out how to make a discount for the next time. You just go into the chat window you're already in and say, hey, Reed didn't like his socks, can we refund them? And see an agent that's going to go make the list API call to find the customer named Reed and see the order that he made that had to do with socks and run the refund action and, maybe create a discount, maybe even use another API to send him a sorry email. He didn't like, the wool or whatever it was, and so on and so forth. And so being able to do all of your work in one place that's really intelligent is a huge part of the promise of agentic AI. And, in order to do that, obviously, your AI chat, your agent is going to have to be able to connect with all these services and take all sorts of different actions.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think one of the things, I've thought about as it relates to this topic is it feels like, especially since I run a core infrastructure company, but obviously we have to have UI and, interfaces for things like the dashboard, managing different elements of projects, as you mentioned earlier. And that's great. We're happy to do it, but it does seem like there are a lot of resources that we put into how do we want to onboard this user, share, unfurl information as they go. Obviously, sometimes you're mimicking other patterns that you see elsewhere. Sometimes those patterns don't work, so you have to invent your own patterns. And overall, I think the end developer, end user ends up with actually a lot of kind of mental friction that they have to go through every time they onboard to a new use case or application. And so just another kind of example of kind of like the socks example that you had, though. But I think about it every time I'm using another B2B SaaS application where, maybe it's only 30 seconds I'm wasting, clicking around trying to find how do I do something. But that does feel like both there was a lot of design and engineering work that went into whatever was created on the end output there. and it's all standing in the way of me actually becoming stickier on the platform and the core functionality. And so to your point, like I think one of the things I get excited about is it feels like there might be a lot of non-differentiated things that we are reinventing the wheel on when it comes to management interfaces, SaaS interfaces, et cetera. And if we can get beyond that to this more natural language ability to access those things, I'm really excited about what that unlocks.
Yeah, software companies are building capabilities, right? And you want to expose your capabilities as cleanly and naturally and flexibly as possible to your customers so that they can take best advantage most easily of the novel stuff that you're bringing into the world.
Yep, definitely. Awesome. Well, I'd love to maybe take it a step further in terms of specifics on, in particular, MCP, Model Context Protocol. How does this relate to this kind of promise for agentic applications, use cases, et cetera? Would love to hear a little bit more about how you think about it at Stainless.
Yeah. So MCP has, I think everyone watching this is aware, has hit a real nerve and found a lot of traction in being a universal way that agents can talk to other software systems, right? And at Stainless, like we think of ourselves as the API company, and what we care about is computers talking to computers, right? And so this really fits squarely in what we love to think about. We're usually thinking about production software talking to production software. But if you want to have an agent talking to production software of some kind, then you're probably going to have to use HTTP, right? And make an API request over the internet in some way, shape, or form. And you're also going to have to let the agent find some way of making that request. And so MCP is a way that, I actually think of it kind of like an SDK for an LLM. So if you're a Python developer and you want an easy, smooth, and interpretable way of making an API request where you kind of know you're not going to get it wrong, then you want a well-typed Python library to do that. And if you're an agent, well, you could sort of YOLO a random API request with curl into the void. And some of the time that's actually going to work great. But a lot of the time for things that are a little bit more nuanced, it won't.
Yep.
And you really want to know, you kind of want that red squiggly line, that type ahead experience, as a model to say, okay, what are the tools available to me, right? So if I like npm install stitch and then stitch.tab as a developer, like what are the options available? That's what MCP brings, is a list of tools like that menu.
Yep.
And then within each of those tools, the documentation of what parameters you can send, what types they are, what's their description. And so that way the model knows exactly how to interact with, for example, the Stitch API, or any API that is exposing an MCP server.
I love that you use the term YOLO there. That's something I'll use to describe it in the future to folks, that yes, the agent without this may be YOLOing into the void when it's trying to figure out how to use this tool. And I think that was just a really good kind of analogy there. I'd love to make this tangible for the folks that obviously are familiar with MCP, but might not be, familiar with the piece that we were talking about a little bit earlier on how this can abstract, like the onboarding to how do I use this, new SaaS platform, this new SaaS product. So one of the things that we were talking about before we started hitting record is Stainless. You don't use Stitch. You haven't been in the Stitch dashboard before. And we just released an MCP server last week. So we figured, why don't we just do a live demo here, see how you take it for a spin, what it's able to produce from a developer experience, and kind of talk through both like that experience, but also how that applies to other kind of MCP use cases that you're seeing in terms of exposing APIs this way to agents.
Great. So let's start. I'm sharing my screen now. And I'll admit I have not used Stitch before today. I've heard great things. One day. But one day, exactly. We're excited for it. And so what I did here is I installed your MCP server, which disclaimer is not generally Stainless. You built this, guys, yourself.
We did, although I think you were showing me some of the other kind of maintenance elements that Stainless gives you. So I think one of the questions I'll have for the team afterwards is, should we go look at Stainless for running this kind of in perpetuity? But today this is just built in-house. Yep.
Amazing. So here I've got Claude Code Up, which is one of the many tools you can use for agentic coding or chat. I could also be doing this in Claude Web or Claude Desktop. I think this is a fairly technical audience, and this is a tool I'm familiar with. So I've asked for a little bit about Stitch. Great. Let's use their MCP server to create a new project and try it out. And what I'm not doing right now is loading your documentation, which I think I've heard is great documentation, or poking around. Okay, so I've got a create project call that's going to do demo project. Sounds like a great project name. Consumer, sure, yeah. And so I'll allow that tool to go through. It's doing some stuff for me in the background. It's even going through doing the configuration, some credentials. Create a public token. Is that a good idea?
Sure. Yeah.
Great. And a secret?
Yep.
Awesome. And I guess now we're going to see if it works. Cool. Get consumer SDK config.
Let's do it.
All right. Now, normally, what would be my next step in getting started with a Stitch integration here?
You might set up a redirect URLs. This is typically something that, the way that we kind of thought about this was historically, years ago, you'd have to go into the dashboard, just add the redirect URLs, by hand. Then we got a lot of requests for people that were trying to maintain multiple projects programmatically to get Terraform support. And then obviously with MCP, the question has been, can we now extend that to agents to be able to take that on their behalf? One of the reasons you need a redirect URL is, let's say that you're using a password reset or a magic link or a OAuth flow. We need to know where to send that user back, and the reason that you need to allow listed is for security reasons. So maybe let's see if we can set a redirect URL.
Great. And here we see it's told me a little bit about my. I guess we're going to have to roll these secrets later before this video goes live. But we'll say let's add a redirect URL, maybe app.stainless.com/stitch redirect.
Sounds good. I'm curious to see if it requires an HTTPS specification, but probably not in test.
I hope it's smart enough. Looks like it is. It's added that for me, and it's allowing login and sign up, which defaults to login. That seemed pretty appropriate.
Yeah,
cool. And it ran into a bug, and it's trying to figure it out by itself. Frolicking.
Yeah. I do love the Claude code.
All right, now it's going to try again. Is it going to have better luck this time?
It should, though. Actually, hit go ahead, and let's see. I'm kind of curious where the agent's running into things.
Perfect. Okay, I think it had login lowercase instead of uppercase or something like that.
Okay, great.
Pretty straightforward. It figured it out by itself. I didn't have to do anything. And I guess I have a Stitch integration ready to go.
Yeah.
Which is pretty incredible. It was really, really easy for me to do. And in comparison, this is the Stitch dashboard. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen it before today. And, I could do this. I look around for projects. Where's the projects? Oh, actually, there's something that makes more sense here where the first project is up here. And this is frankly, a really awesome looking dashboard, and you guys probably put a lot of work into it. And I can see all this stuff. But it might have taken me a little bit more time, to do that. And even if this would have been faster, even if this would have been more pleasant, I'm probably integrating Stitch in the context of something else.
Yeah.
Right. I'm building somewhat bigger auth flow, so maybe say, great, now let's pull it in to the website code. And there's no code in this directory, so it probably will get confused. So I won't ask it to do that. But that's a small example of why you might want to expose a lot of your dashboard functionality. Your admin functionality, admin API through an MCP server, so people can use chat if that's what they want to do.
That's great. And if you briefly go back to the dashboard, just because I think it cements something we were talking about earlier. It's even if I would say our Eng team is proud of the dashboard they've made, but even if you're proud, every time a new user onboards to this, you're making short mental shortcuts or, heuristics about, okay, where do I think projects would be? Do I go to this drop down? Do I go to project overview? Redirect URLs, maybe you find that you're still you're reading, tens of words every time that you're trying to find one of these things and trying to look for heuristics and clues. And yes, that's easy all in isolation. And maybe it takes 10 seconds here, 20 seconds there. Maybe you get lost one time, it's a minute. But all of that are pieces of friction that you don't want to add up in kind of that customer experience, whether it's end user or developer. And then the other piece that I think about is I think your point was right that if you're building this within the context of, other things that you're touching or using other services, and you're in Claude Code, it's much easier for you as a developer, or even in a consumer context where it's not in the coding context, for you to stay in a flow state and not have to deal with here's a net new, slightly different variant of a SaaS dashboard or a consumer dashboard or app that I have to go navigate. So to your point, just super exciting future, even if a lot of these things are early, but the adoption's been great. Obviously, we were getting pushed by our developers to support something like this. I'm sure Stainless, I know that you guys make it easy for people to generate MCPs. I'm curious, when did you ship the Stainless MCP, and what was the demand like from your own developers for that?
Yeah, so we started shipping an MCP, offering MCP server generator a couple months ago now, I think. We saw just a lot of interest and uptake where people are, obviously everybody is saying, okay, is this going to be useful for our business, for our customers, et cetera? What are the use cases that are going to really matter, so on and so forth. Now, it's on the face of it, a very, very straightforward task to translate an OpenAPI spec to an MCP server. An MCP server sort of definition is just JSON schema. OpenAPI spec is also just JSON schema. So in theory, you can take the same stuff and just move it over to a different file format.
Yep.
And for each one of the tools, just make a simple fetch request, or whatever your equivalent is. And that sounds really nice. And we were able to get a demo out quite quickly that enabled that. There's a bunch of little paper cuts you run into along the way, or other tricky things, where, the way that you do references for components, for people who are familiar with, and schemas for people who are familiar with OpenAPI spec or JSON schema, that's a little different. You have to change that. Not all of the MCP clients can handle, any of versus one of versus all of. And so you have to simplify things, et cetera, et cetera. But the basic mechanics are straightforward. And what we started with was, okay, every endpoint in your OpenAPI spec has a tool in your MCP server. And I think a lot of people think that that's kind of the only way you can do it. It is the sort of simple, obvious thing. It actually has a lot of problems to do it that way. If your API, really when you start using it, if your API is of any significant size. So if you've got 5 endpoints, 10 endpoints, simple API calls, that's gonna go great. If you're a typical real business with dozens of engineers, you probably have, or more, you probably have dozens of endpoints, maybe hundreds of endpoints in your API. And a lot of times the request parameters are pretty rich and complicated. You have a lot of important documentation around them. And as you see, you have to, that documentation matters, right? We need to know that login was uppercase, right? And they figured it out, but there's sort of a lot there. And what ends up happening if you upload your entire large API? So let's talk about Stripe, right? Stripe now has many hundreds of endpoints. If you were to map every single thing to a tool, you're going to end up with tens of thousands of tokens for context used up just in those tool definitions. And most of the time, you're not going to use most of them, right? And the API calls are also going to be a little bit unintuitive in many cases to the LLM, right? You have to often make a sequence of tool calls where you're, again, you're fetching, you're trying to find the read user, right? And then you're trying to make an update based on that. And so you have to pull the ID from here and put it over there. And actually, a lot of times that gets lost along the way. And so you'd rather have one tool that would be like refund based on name or something like that. And that would be more intuitive to an LLM, just like a great SDK call is more intuitive to a developer. But there you get into a combinatorial problem, right? There's a lot of things you can do with an API. And these context window problems in terms of the number of tools you can reasonably use and how well you can reasonably describe them puts a really tight limit. People say not to use more than 20 or 40 tools in one session, which is very tight limit, right? And so, Stitch has many more endpoints than that alone. And if you wanted to be able to do stuff with Stitch and with your cloud provider at the same time, or your deployment provider at the same time, well, you can't fit it in the model's head. And that's a problem. So we've also rolled out a variety of tools to help people say, okay, I want to use the Stitch API's MCP server, but I only want to use the project's resource, or I only, so dash filter equal, resource equals projects, or dash operation equals read to only get read with two E's to only get operations that won't mutate anything.
Okay.
But there's a lot more further afield that I think we're going to need in order for this to really scale. And ultimately, you don't want to have to think in advance of the limitations you're imposing, either as an API provider or as an API consumer, right? You just want everything to work.
And when you work with customers or partners that you're helping kind of generate MCPs, maintain them, how do you advise them to start simple? I think you covered a few of those different elements there, but I'd love to understand, like, if I'm a customer of Stainless, what are some of the pointers I'd get, maybe the technologies I'd use in your dashboard, things like that?
So if actually you went to not Stainless and you went out and looked for the sort of best practices from the MCP team at Anthropic or, other resources on the internet, what they'll tell you is to, the industry, wisdom right now is to choose a handful of your happy path use cases that you think people are going to really want to use in an agentic context and handcraft a few tools there. Maybe it makes one API call, maybe it makes a handful. So maybe for Stripe, it's a refund flow of some kind, or charging a customer, or something like that. Or, maybe for Stitch, it's setting up a new project and it does that whole flow that we just saw. Maybe that's all one tool. And so that's something that you can, pardon the pun, stitch together using the MCP servers that we generate. And so we kind of, in addition to giving you the tools, we give you the building blocks, and you can mix and match and ship your own pretty straightforwardly. It's just very it's all just TypeScript code, and you've got a great SDK underlying it. So that's where I would say to get started. You can also, of course, expose the entire API through a few different simple mechanisms. So if you're not sure what those use cases are, which is really common, or if you think you might be surprised by what users do in practice, and let's say you have a large API, we have a dynamic mode where instead of generating one tool for every single endpoint in your API, we do three tools total, no matter how large your API is. So one is list endpoints. So tell me what's inside the Stitch API, tell me what's inside the Stripe API, what have you. The other is get endpoint, like just describe, what's in this create project tool. And then the third is invoke endpoint. And so this is a way of basically doing a totally dynamic set of tools where you're not using up any context hardly at all until it's desired. There's some other trade-offs with that as well. The user has to watch this happen. And so it's a little bit slower. It's 3 calls instead of 1. But it's a good way to kind of test the waters and see what are people interested in trying, and then take it from there.
That's great. And if somebody, supported that initially and then wanted to kind of monitor what was actually being tried by users, what's the best way for them to get that observability and that monitoring capability?
We send headers with every request, so you would just check your API logs that are on your side. We're not sitting in the middle here, so we're not getting any telemetry ourselves. And see what's coming through with the MCP header.
Okay, cool.
On the user agent.
Awesome. Well, I think you might have one other thing to show us. So I wanted to make sure that we could go a little bit deeper on maybe this use case of building or maintaining an MCP server.
Yeah, you bet. Just really quick, wanted to kind of show off what it's like to set up some of those things. So if for people who are interested in some of this stuff, this is the Stainless sort of SDK studio. So this is how Replicate, an AI company, is one of our customers. And this is how they kind of set up and configure their TypeScript SDK. It's also where they'll say, okay, let me add an MCP server. And here we can, and they ship that to NPM as Replicate MCP. Here they've chosen not to enable all resources. And so only the ones that they want to expose are they doing. And so here you can see their collections.list endpoint they do want in their MCP server, getting a collection similarly, so on and so forth. And so they just change that there. But if they wanted to do some of that, dump the whole kitchen sink.
Yep.
They just change this false to true, and off to the races.
Okay, great. And out of curiosity, from the use cases you've seen uptake on for building these MCP servers, are there any trends in terms of like, the vertical of companies that you're serving that are fast? I'm sure obviously AI probably moves faster than others, but curious if there are any other kind of like, more specific, interesting trends that you've seen in use cases and types of companies that are taking it up faster.
This is something that everyone is and should be looking into, honestly. Mm-hmm. We've talked with everyone from, I'm not sure which of these names I can mention, but several kind of Fortune 500 type of companies that you wouldn't necessarily think of as the replicates of the world.
Yep.
I think, as with any new tool, if your business has early adopters in your customer base, this is something that you should probably be at least experimenting with. Mm-hmm. And if your business, I think where it has the most traction is if you have an audience that logs into your SaaS app a lot.
Yep.
And also is forward thinking, right? Mm-hmm. And so, for example, internally at Stainless, we use a company called Pylon for customer support.
Yep.
And our support engineers are using that MCP server every single day. Mm-hmm. Because they're able to link between the support case and information from GitHub and information in Linear, our ticket tracker, and our internal notes in Notion, mm-hmm. and all sorts of stuff all in one chat, without having to switch any tabs. It's pretty incredible. And so there you see active use every single day. Mm-hmm. And so if you have people, again, logging into your dashboards, that's a big one. The other use case that we've been seeing from customers is, it's less frequent, but it's powerful, which is reporting and analytics. So, I was talking with a company called Mux, which does, one of our customers, which does video APIs. And you can just now go in and say, hey, how did my videos perform yesterday? And it can make a bunch of API requests. It can analyze a bunch of data. It can, if depending on your MCP client that you're using, it'll write some Python code. Yep. to analyze all of that. It's pretty incredible. Now, people only do reporting maybe once a month. And so, they're not necessarily doing that every day. But when they do, that just saves somebody, so much work they wouldn't have even done it before.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And the stuff that we've seen these tools do like this is pretty incredible.
It's a good point about, somebody is doing that activity and it's not just to go faster at something they would have previously done, but in that Mux case, they might have just never done it prior because the friction was not worth the output. It's a good point. I'm interested to see the other emergent cases like that, where I've been thinking it more about what is it streamline that I already do, but I'm sure there's a lot of those cases where like the support engineer one is an interesting one because, whenever we get a feature request, we need to be tagging it in Linear, but there is human friction in someone going from the support flow to like, I'm going to go into Linear, I'm going to +1 it, give some context.
Not everything makes it into Linear.
Yes.
At any software company. Yeah, exactly.
So you're right. I'm really interested about those things that maybe get dropped today or wouldn't get picked up because humans are friction averse. It's one of the common truths amongst all of us. But that's great. That's a really interesting use case. Before we wrap up, I'm curious, are there any major takeaways that you'd want, folks listening to this video, watching this video, to take away if they were to think about how do I start building an MCP server for my own resources and make this a great developer experience, user experience, both upfront and then as they continue in terms of evolving it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to think about. The first thing is that this is still in a very experimental stage. And so whatever you're doing, this doesn't really need to be said, hopefully. Expect the whole universe around it to evolve in 3 months and again in 6 months. And so that's one background thing, and that affects a lot of how you might approach the engineering aspect of building something out. OAuth is actually really critical. We're seeing a lot of a lot of our API customers who are looking at MCP are saying, shoot, we just have to add OAuth to our API now. If you try to do that yourself, it's a lot of work. I don't know if you guys know anything about that.
You're lobbing it up for me, so I do appreciate it. Yeah, it's great. We're going to pair this video, and if folks have already seen it, we do have a video that walks through how you can turn your app into an OAuth 2 compliant identity provider.
Oh, wow.
So you can just get this on top of your API
okay, great.
out of the box. And maybe there needs to be a tighter integration between Stitch and Stainless there.
I actually think there should be.
Yeah.
Because that's the most difficult. This is not a sales pitch. There's no commercial arrangement here. But the hardest thing that our customers have in terms of going live with a remote MCP server, like we have like one-click deploy to Cloudflare. We're adding other options like that. But you need OAuth, right? And we want that to be one click, and it can be.
Yep.
Right. And so that's a really a major thing, because a lot of companies won't adopt it without that, and the usability with OAuth for MCP, for remote MCP, is dramatically better. The other thing I would think about, there's a lot of small considerations, right? Your API responses that you're giving back to the model have to be small, so it doesn't get lost or overwhelmed. In fact, there's an upper limit on how many bytes you can even give. Many API endpoints are above that, so you have to think about how to filter that out. Our MCP servers offer a JQ filter tool that the model can do built into the same API request, and only get the narrow bits of the API that it needs, which has been really powerful. But you want to think about something in that direction. Again, thinking about the flows of if you have a chain of requests to make, really anything where your developers would, when writing a code integration, would be copy pasting a series of API calls from your documentation page. At the present state of the art, you want to pull that into one tool. That is going to be limiting and brittle. And so, at Stainless, we're working on general solutions there that are not released at this time, that will kind of make that one shot. The last thing I would say, we've been talking about MCP in an API use case, where people want to do operational things with that MCP server in their day-to-day work. And that's one that I'm really, really excited about. I think the MCP tool category that has the most live traction today actually is more on the documentation side of things. So developers in Cursor, and they're integrating with Stitch, and they're saying, hey, Cursor, do my Stitch integration for me.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And link it in with my database and, all the rest. And, I'm sure your MCP server offers, all sorts of documentation information to help guide an AI coding agent, very different from an AI, chat agent, in the right direction. And so, they're totally separate use cases typically. But you don't want to forget about the docs one if you're shipping an API that you also want people to write production software integrations with. Which is typical.
Awesome. I mean, that's great. I think all of this is invaluable information for folks as they're kind of navigating the MCP landscape. Well, thank you so much, Alex. Maybe just as kind of like the last note, as folks maybe want to continue reading more information on how Stainless helps around this, your different topics that you might individually post about, how should people find you or Stainless and reach out?
Yeah, stainless.com is our website. And so we've got everything there. I'm at RatTrayAlex on most social platforms.
Awesome. Well, and thank you to the audience again for joining us as we continue with the Agent Ready video series.